Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking all things mental skills training with Dr. Sam Thrower. Sam, welcome.
Hi Dan, yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I've been a long time listener actually, it's really nice to finally be a guest, and you've accompanied me on many runs as well. So it's really cool to finally be on the show.
Have your times got quicker as a consequence of listening in?
No, I don't think so. It's probably getting slower over time.
You're not pacing yourself based on the voice of my guest and my own voice?
No, not quite, but it helps the time go quicker.
Fair enough. Well, look, it's so good to have you on, and I'm really excited to talk about your recent research and unpack psychological skills with you. But before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your work.
Yes, I mean, my journey started out back in 2007. I studied sports science at the University of Wales Institute Cardiff, which is now known as Cardiff Metropolitan University. And after graduating, I wasn't entirely sure what to do. There was a small pot of money you could apply for to stay on and do a master's. So I did that. And I studied applied sports psychology for a year. And that was a really good experience. Really lucky to have a lot of great sports psychologists back then. Sheldon Hanton, Lynn Evans, and Rich Neal, Owen Thomas, Ian Mitchell was still around as well. So yeah, I had a really good kind of exposure to applied sports psychology, as well as some very good researchers. And I ended up doing my project with Owen Thomas, looking at types and sources of sport confidence in academy footballers. And that was really kind of, I guess, the starting point for my interest in youth sport, and a real interest and sort of passion around how do we develop and sort of cultivate environments that prevent some of the sort of issues and challenges we see happening. So really taking kind of a proactive look at sports psychology. I think sometimes we're quite a reactive discipline. So that was always kind of my view on things. And coming towards the end of my master's, Chris Harwood was advertising for a PhD in sport parenting. And obviously kind of the two things really aligned quite well. And I thought, well, that looks like a great opportunity. So I applied for that and was lucky enough to get it. And then I moved up to Loughborough. So I spent 3 years up there, 3.5 years actually, working on essentially developing, implementing and evaluating sport parent education programs in the context of tennis. And that was pretty novel back then. Not many people were doing that. So it was a really exciting time. And after graduating, I was looking for jobs and a post came up at Kingston University. So I moved back down south and worked there for a year. That was a maternity cover. At the end of that, I then went back up the M1 to Loughborough and did a postdoc with Chris again. And that was kind of an extension of our work that we'd started during the PhD. And then I went back down the M1, so you can see the theme and the pattern here, and took a permanent position at the University of Roehampton as a lecturer in sport and exercise psychology. And I worked there for 4.5 years. And then at the start of this year, I joined Oxford Brookes. Now a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology there.
Hell of a journey so far, and you mentioned a couple of sports there, football, tennis. What's your own sporting background?
Yeah, my main sport was always football growing up. I was never a great footballer, but I sort of played at a county level. We won the FA County Youth Cup, which was kind of my claim to fame. Played very briefly, semi-professionally before university, and then played at Cardiff Met just before they got good, actually, just before they kind of got into the Welsh Premier League and everything else. So I'm sure those things are correlated to some extent, me leaving and then becoming pretty good.
I'm sure not. I'm sure that's not true. That's a good level, though, Sam. That's a good level. Semi-professional level. You've got to be a damn good player to get to that level. What position did you play in? And in terms of your own mindset, when you reflect back, was it strength? Was it an area that, when you reflect back, wow, I could have been so much better?
Yeah, I was a holding midfielder. I don't think I was particularly talented at a sort of technical and tactical level, but I worked really hard and, I kind of went around and won my headers and won my tackles and passed to some people that were slightly better on the ball than I was. It was a good time, good experience.
Claude Makelele role, that type of thing, is that?
Yeah, perhaps not quite as graceful, but similar sort of thing, yeah.
Fair enough. And you mentioned the PhD you did in sport parenting and in postdoc work there. I mean, that's still is that still an interest to you, sports parenting?
Yeah, absolutely. I still think it's probably my main area of research, and really kind of taking quite an applied look at it. You know, a lot of the work that we do now is evaluating the effectiveness of interventions that we're rolling out. We work quite closely with the Lawn Tennis Association on their parent education support strategy, and yeah, we've been delivering workshops for years on that, and sort of doing research alongside it as well to try and evaluate effectiveness. So it's kind of an ongoing process that. But yeah, that's one of my main passions for sure.
Just dwelling briefly on that, and not to put you too much on the spot here, Sam, because I think this is an interesting landscape, sport parenting, and in very simple terms, I think a lot of people in sport talk about parents distancing themselves from their child's sport, not mentoring them, coaching them, adopting an appropriate parental role when it comes to their interest and their activity within their child's sport. And yet in tennis, one might suggest that the great Sir Andy Murray, and his experiences with his mother, Judy Murray, who has been an incredible parent, an incredible coach herself, an advisor to young tennis players. She took quite a hands-on role, or at least my perception of her involvement with Andy's development was that she was pretty hands-on. I think she's spoken to this a number of times. Did you have any thoughts on that juxtaposition there between being involved, distancing oneself from their child's coaching and development?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think partly it comes back to the nature of the sport. You know, a lot of the time, young athletes or young tennis players won't have coaches traveling with them to tournaments, and therefore parents often have to fulfill this kind of dual parent coach role. You know, we often talk about it as like being the assistant coach, in the sense of they're the ones having the conversations before the tournament. They're the ones probably interacting during the tournament, and then doing some sort of debrief on the way home. So a lot of the work that we do is trying to upskill parents around, you know, what good looks like in those interactions, because they're invariably the ones that, you know, interacting with the child, you know, in those time points. So yeah, I think it's slightly different. If there was a coach on the scene, then perhaps parents don't necessarily have to be so hands-on and so involved. But when there's not, they invariably kind of fulfill those roles and those positions, and therefore ultimately kind of working with parents to educate them and support them in order to be able to do that effectively is really important.
Now we're here today to talk primarily about a paper you wrote recently alongside a lot of very, very brilliant sports psychologists who we'll name in a second. The paper is entitled Enhancing Wellbeing, Long-Term Development and Performance in Youth Sport. Insights from experienced applied sports psychologists working with young athletes in the United Kingdom. And your fellow authors for this is like a who's who of sports psychologists here, Sam. You had some fantastic people working with you. Jamie Barker, Adam Bruden, Pete Coffey, Jennifer Cumming, Chris Harwood, who was your supervisor at Loughborough and has recently been on the Sports Site Show, Karen Howes, Camilla Knight, Paul McCarthy, and Stephen Mellor. A whole bunch of people who have actually, most of them have been on the show before. That's a great lineup there, mate.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we'll come on to talk a little bit about the kind of research working group later. But yeah, kind of in 2020, I was interested in doing some research in this space. And often the best things are kind of the collaborations, right? When you bring kind of practitioners and researchers together, you know, to kind of bounce ideas off and come up with some really good research questions. So yeah, it's fantastic to have so many influences on this paper, actually, and people kind of looking at it from different angles and through different lenses. I certainly think it helped in terms of the quality of the paper itself.
Let's talk a little bit about the genesis of this paper. This paper about enhancing wellbeing, long-term development and performance in youth sport. That tripartite is so important, isn't it? Unpack the history behind this paper for us.
Yeah, and I thought about this before coming on the show today, and I think the origins of it trace back to 2018. So it's been about 5 years in the making, this one. And it was when I was a postdoc with Chris at Loughborough, and he was invited by Dan Gould and Al Smith to write a review article and it was essentially to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Institute for the Study of Youth Sport at Michigan State. And they asked him to write a review article around performance enhancement in the young athlete. And of course, as his postdoc at that point, it landed up on my desk. And he said, look, can we put everything aside for a few weeks? The deadline's quite tight on this one. And I want to do it. And I was like, yeah, it really aligns with my kind of passions and areas of interest as well. And some things particularly around kind of psychological skills training that I'd always been passionate about, but hadn't necessarily looked at from a research perspective. So we ended up writing that review article, and it was fascinating. I really enjoyed kind of delving into that body of work, and we wrote some really kind of, I guess, fairly hard-hitting critical reflections at the end of that paper about the state of the field and the state of the literature itself, and they really kind of acted as the foundation for the paper we're going to talk about today. So I'm happy to go through them very briefly because I think they kind of provide some nice context for what we're going to go on to talk about. And the first one that really surprised me was this idea that actually there's a lot of papers out there that had looked at psychological skills training and performance enhancement. And that's kind of contrary to what's often said in the literature. Often people will say things in papers around, oh, we know a lot about this with collegiate level athletes and elite athletes, but we don't know much about it in the context of youth sport. And we uncovered about 80 different papers that had looked at this. So there's a fair body of literature to draw upon. But what was also quite interesting was around this idea that, probably with the exception of imagery, there was a real kind of lack of depth and quality to that research that would get anywhere close to kind of age and stage and sport-specific guidelines for psychological skills training that could be kind of fed back into the work that practitioners are doing. And that was quite interesting as well, because not only was there a lack of sort of specific recommendations and guidance, but we'd also noticed that there wasn't a lot of commitment in terms of researchers to this area of inquiry. And a lot of people did one or two papers and then perhaps left the field. And we were really interested in why that was happening. And the only possible explanation was that, there's a real sort of lack of funding in this space, from sort of government funding or research council funding. And therefore, people are not genuinely committed to advancing knowledge in this area because perhaps they're going off and conducting research in areas that are a bit more fruitful from a financial perspective. And one of the other things that we kind of really noticed in this body of work was that a lot of the research, in terms of the way in which it was done, was a little bit limited. And I'm kind of always conscious of being critical about other people's work, but a lot of it had been delivered by researchers, not practitioners. So therefore the people delivering the interventions are not necessarily trained in how to do that. That's pretty common. A lot of them are following, fairly kind of well-controlled designs, which is good from a research perspective, but less so in terms of its transferability into the real world context.
Oh, yes.
Very few had looked at actually the needs and wants of the athletes themselves, just kind of got together a group of young athletes and delivered an intervention. And I think perhaps the most important point for me, and one that's perhaps most interesting in terms of the listeners as well, is how overlooked coaches and parents were. And I think they play such an integral role in terms of intervention effectiveness in youth sport. And everyone really needs to be singing off the sort of same hymn sheet. And that's often not the case in the literature. So we sort of said, well, youth sport's at a little bit of a crossroads here in terms of the research, and probably only progress is really going to be made in this area if we see better sort of commitment and collaboration between applied practitioners and researchers. And that was really kind of the point in which we left that review paper. And to be honest, I didn't do a lot in this field for a couple of years. And it wasn't until the summer of 2020 when, I was kind of reflecting on my own research and areas that I was interested in exploring a bit further from a research perspective. And that was when I kind of reflected back on some of those critical reflections and thought, well, I've said all these things were important, and yet I've done absolutely nothing in this space since then. And that was when I started to formulate this kind of research working group. So I wrote an application, and the BPS are great in terms of funding kind of small pots of funding, but funding small research groups that really want to kind of breathe some life into an area of inquiry. And I wrote an application. I sent it around to all the authors that you listed off on paper and said, look, I'm trying to build a team here. Are you interested in getting involved? And pretty much everyone came back and said, yeah, we'd love to be involved, really enthusiastic about this as well. And we'd like to kind of not only advance research, but but also try and make sure that, we're moving towards a point where one day maybe there's some sort of real specific guidance for practitioners when working with young athletes. So yeah, that's really the kind of the origins of the paper, I suppose.
Reflecting back what I've heard, I mean, I think this is fascinating. It's certainly an area I'm super interested in. You're invested in studying well-being, long-term development and performance of youth athletes, and very much through the lens of psychological skills training. Psychological skills training can positively impact performance, long-term development, well-being. Contrary to some beliefs out there, there's actually a large body of literature to investigates and supports the use of psychological skills training within sport, but perhaps a lack of depth as in differentiating psychological skills training across age groups, stages of sport development, and the specificity of sports, different sports and what different sports mean to psychological skills training. Frustratingly, from a historical perspective, researchers who have committed themselves to research in this area have only done so briefly. So there's a lack of commitment over a long term. And this area has tended to be researched by researchers and less so by practitioners. So that there's a perhaps at times a lack of real world validity there, and there can be a tendency to overlook coaches and parents. That's kind of the landscape that you found when you started out on this project.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of those things have really led to a point where there's quite a big gap between research and practice. We've got a lot of research to draw upon, but even when you go and read that research, it's very difficult to look at that and say, right, I fully understand now how I can then go and work with young athletes to deliver this in a real world applied context. And I guess the sort of the broader approach for the research working group was trying to narrow that gap a little bit. And ultimately this first paper is perhaps a way of doing that in terms of really shining a light on what practitioners are doing, because we'd already kind of done that with the review around this is what the research says, and therefore let's go and then look at kind of what practitioners are doing. And then once we've got those two studies together, then how do we kind of start to look at ways in which we can narrow the gap between those two things? And what we're currently working on is a position statement, which has kind of clear recommendations and guidelines, not only for researchers, but also for practitioners based on the work that we've done.
Let's talk about psychological skills training. Let's unpack that term a little bit, because I know there will be people listening in, probably sports psychologists, who will know a lot about psychological skills training, who could probably talk all day like I could about psychological skills training. There will be a lot of coaches who have heard of that term. And we've spoken in a few episodes about psychological skills training at the Sports Psych Show, but there'll be coaches listening in who will know that term, but might not be able to, might not know that much about what psychological skills training brings to the table. So can you unpack psychological skills training for us?
Yeah, for sure. And I think for me, it's a difference between psychological techniques and strategy and psychological skills. So I will look at it in terms of psychological techniques and strategies being things like imagery and self-talk and relaxation and goal setting. And then I'll look at psychological skills being, I guess, this ability to regulate your kind of cognitive, your emotional and your behavioral states. And of course, then the psychological techniques and strategies really feed into, in the context of this paper, a young person's ability to be able to do those things.
And how do psychological skills tend to be trained? Has there historically been an approach or method to deliver on psychological skills?
Yeah, I mean, we spoke about this actually quite a lot in the interviews and focus groups. And I guess the way in which it's traditionally been taught, or the way in which often people assume it's delivered, is by doing, a 1 hour session on imagery one week, and then the next week you're coming back and you're then doing a session on self-talk, and so on and so forth. And I think that was perhaps one of the most interesting kind of themes that came out of the paper, was the way in which applied practitioners are not really doing that anymore. They're recognizing, and probably through experience in many instances, that doesn't really land with young people. they're struggling to see how they can take these things that they're learning in classroom and implement them in the real world. And therefore, they're being a bit more innovative and creative in the way in which they're doing that. And it's not necessarily saying that you can't get a group of young people together in a classroom setting and have a really good session. But in order for that to happen, perhaps it's got to be located in a particular topic. Not necessarily this is a session on goal setting. It might be a session on this is, how you can perform under pressure. And let's look at some examples and maybe some YouTube videos of elite athletes doing this well. And let's see what we can kind of unpack there. And then it's really trying to piece on the kind of the psychological techniques and skills into what young people are able to do. And therefore, I think that's the sort of thing that really connects and resonates more with young people and helps that kind of transferability into what they're doing in training and competition.
So in simple terms, historically, sports psychologists have tended to deliver psychological skills an hour a week. Here's an hour on self-talk, here's an hour on imagery, and so on and so forth. Whereas these days we're talking about delivering it in a more dynamic manner. And potentially with and through coaches and parents, which we'll come on to talk about, I'm sure. This study very much investigated that. Tell me a little bit about who you studied here, or who the participants are, and how you went about this piece of research.
Yeah, so we were really interested in trying to gain some insights into the consultancy process. What practitioners actually doing in the real world. And there have been a couple of papers that we sort of talk about in the introduction, one by Foster and colleagues and one by Chris Henriksen. And they'd sort of spoken about what practitioners are doing when they're delivering psychological skills. And they're great papers, but we were kind of looking at this a bit more broadly and saying, well, there's a lot that goes into kind of applied practice in the lead up to perhaps the delivery of psychological skills training intervention, which has perhaps been overlooked, and starting right with things like consulting philosophies and how to assess young athletes' needs and wants, etc. So really we were saying, well, let's take a more sort of fine-grained look at the whole consultancy process here, and really kind of gain an insight in relation to that. And the way in which we did that was essentially to find some practitioners who were very experienced in the field. And I use that quite loosely because some of them were very experienced in terms of the amount of time they'd been working with young athletes. But I was also mindful of I don't want everyone to kind of view the world in the same way. So we got some younger practitioners who, had a fair few years, of experience, but a little bit different from a generational perspective, perhaps. And therefore, what are they doing? Are they doing things slightly differently? Are they a bit more innovative? Are they using technology? These sorts of things. So essentially, we just were looking for really information-rich cases. And the study itself was split into two parts because one of the things we recognized fairly early on was there was a lot of expertise within the research working group, and a lot of people that fit the inclusion criteria. So we said, well, let's start with focus groups. And we did two focus groups. And the first one, we got about halfway through the interview guide and we were already 2 hours in. So we had to come back the following week. But, it was amazing. And what I really kind of liked about that experience was they were bouncing ideas off each other, and they were saying, oh, do you do it that way? And I've never quite thought about it like that. It's a really good idea. I've always wondered if that was the right thing to do, but I'm really pleased to see that other people were doing it that way as well. So I think they really enjoyed being part of the focus group, and it was almost like a kind of CPD event, to share experiences and insights around how they go about consulting with young athletes. And following the focus groups, we then went out to kind of recruit people who we knew. So they were kind of our extended network, and obviously sports psychology is quite a small community. But essentially people that we thought would be really information-rich cases that have worked across a range of different sports, a range of different age groups. So it's quite a diverse sample, but we had a lot of really interesting people to interview. And I spent a lot of time that summer talking to people about exactly this.
Let's unpack some results. Break this down for me a little bit.
Yeah, so we had 5 different themes, and the first one was called Clear Intentions, Motives and Boundaries. And I think this was one of the first things that really sort of jumped out to me in terms of the results when I was analysing them, that everyone had a really strong rationale for working with young athletes. And a lot of these are very experienced practitioners who I'm sure, if they had the choice, and I'm sure they did, they could work with elite level athletes or in any context they wanted. But essentially they were choosing to work with young athletes because they felt really passionate about trying to create, youth sports systems that were beneficial, to this young person, that would help them develop and progress over time. And a lot of what they were really interested in was trying to get it right from the very beginning. How can we create an environment around this young person or this young team that's going to help them manage the challenges and the transitions that are quite inevitable? We know it's a rocky road, right? And you can anticipate a lot of things that young people will experience. And then instead of just kind of allowing them to experience it and figure it out on their own, how can we actually kind of, I guess, give them the tools and the resources they're going to need to navigate some of those challenges? And therefore, a lot of what they were really kind of motivated by was, how can we help this person grow and develop? How can we try and expand, and avoid an instance where you've got a young athlete with a really narrow athletic identity? And how can we maybe equip them with some life skills along the way as well, so that there's some sort of psychological return on their investment? And one of the practitioners spoke about this idea of, working in an elite football academy, and of course, knowing full well that a lot of them won't make it through, and saying, well, actually, it's my kind of obligation or my duty of care to make sure that when that young person leaves the academy, they're able to look back and say, do you know that I'm really disappointed in perhaps how that played out, but it was a really good experience. And I think, we know from a lot of newspaper articles that that's not always the case. So really kind of clear intentions, really clear motives around what they were trying to do. And then in some instances, quite clear boundaries about the way in which they worked as well. And a lot of them spoke about sort of really making sure that it had the best interests of the child. And it wasn't just a case of working with a young athlete because the coach or the parent wanted you to, that it was really going to be beneficial to this young athlete. And also the way in which they worked as well. So a lot of them were saying, well, when it's a really young athlete, my starting point is to try and work indirectly. Let's have a look at what it is in that environment that's perhaps making it really difficult and challenging for this young person. And maybe that's the starting point. And therefore, it's not just a case of sitting down with a 7, 8-year-old and trying to equip them with some skills. The starting point is to look at this more indirectly, first of all. And then perhaps as they get a little bit older and perhaps they're able to kind of reach out to a sports psychologist and ask for support, then maybe that's when they start to work more directly. So that was really the kind of foundational theme, I guess, in some ways, but really clear to me around, these people felt so passionate about working with young athletes and really wanted to try and create these environments that would help nurture that young person.
Well, to speak to what you've just said there, Sam, I mean, under this theme of clear intentions, motives and boundaries, reading through this section, two words that really hit home are holistic and boundaries, I suppose, or a couple of other words, age appropriateness. So the holistic side, I'm just reading from your text here a quote. A sports psychologist said, it's a holistic philosophy. It's about focusing on the personal growth, identity, and psychosocial skills of the athlete and their well-being, as well as the athletic development and performance side of their identity. So for me, and it'll be interesting to get your comment on this, when we think of psychological skills training, perhaps sometimes we're guilty of thinking of those narrow techniques of imagery, self-talk, relaxation, etc., etc. But those, for me, what could be considered as narrow techniques can broaden into opportunities to develop people, not just players, but people holistically. And then the age appropriateness piece, which you mentioned yourself. Some of the sports psychologists here speak about working with and through coaches and parents for very young athletes, the importance of emphasizing enjoyment, excitement, friends, and being active when it comes to the youngest of youth players, people. So, so some interesting stuff that came through on this theme.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that kind of the point around it being, really centered around a holistic development is an important one. And we often look at things like life skills and psychological skills training as if they're sort of exclusive to each other, and they're not. There's so much crossover and so much overlap there, and really a lot of these psychological skills that the practitioners developing in these young people are not just centered around enhancing performance. They're things that can be translated and transferred into other areas of their lives. And I think that's really where the practitioners see the benefit, because yes, they'll work with a young athlete to improve their development or help them manage some of the stresses and demands they're experiencing. But of course, that might have a knock-on effect in terms of education or other areas of their life around music or art or whatever it may be. So I think that's a really important aspect of the whole thing, really, that it's not just centered on performance. There's something broader happening here, and a lot of the practitioners see the real value of sports psychology as being able to do that.
The next theme, flexible and adaptable theoretical approaches. We're in danger of geeking out as a couple of sports psychologists speaking here and going in depth into different modalities, but can you unpack this one for me, please?
Yeah, sure. And I'm not a practitioner, but I was fascinated by what they were going to say here, because I'd obviously been through the training pathway and been exposed to kind of different theoretical approaches. And I've also taught on MSc programs that do this as well. So I know how it's delivered. And invariably, it's a 1 or 2 hour lecture on a humanistic approach. It's a 1 or 2 hour lecture on cognitive behavioral therapy and so on and so forth. And I think I always struggled with how that transferred into applied sports psychology practice. I saw how it would work in clinical psychology, and if perhaps someone, didn't really like the way in which you approach the sessions, then you could always refer them to someone down the corridor who might have a different approach that might resonate with them more and connect with them more. But I sort of always wondered how that was transferred into applied sports psychology practice. And therefore, like I said, really intrigued to see what they were going to answer here. And as you can imagine, they existed, or they sort of located themselves along the continuum. Some were more humanistic, some were more like sort of practitioner led and drawing on CBT, and ACT as well was quite a popular one. But I think the really interesting element was that they all had this kind of core approach, but they were essentially drawing on different kind of techniques from different schools of thought as well. And when I sort of prompted and probed them around this, a lot of them said, well, yeah, I'm pretty eclectic, I'm pretty integrative, I'm pluralistic, I'm pragmatic, and they're all using different terms, but essentially saying there's one organizing sort of theoretical approach, but they draw upon all these different schools of thought in terms of the work that they do, and provided, very valid rationales for doing that, around saying, well, it's partly dependent on the situation, because, I might be a more humanistic psychologist in terms of my organizing approach. But if a young athlete comes to me in the corridor and says, I've got a game that's kicking off in an hour and I'm really anxious, can you give me a strategy or technique that might help me there? You kind of feel that obligation to try and support them as best you can in that moment. And that might go against your kind of core philosophy to a certain extent, but I guess it's being flexible and adaptable in the environment. And similar sort of thing with wants and needs of the young athlete. If you're the only sports psychologist working in an academy, and that an actually young athlete would benefit much more from something that's more practitioner led, it's very difficult then to say, well, I view the world in this way and I'm much more kind of humanistic perhaps in my approach. So I think what a lot of the practitioners spoke about made a lot of common sense. And it was, really kind of about fulfilling employer expectations to a certain extent, and avoiding the need to refer based on, the sort of theoretical approach alone. And we spoke quite a lot about that in discussion as well, because if that's the way in which, the experienced practitioners are working in youth sport these days, then we maybe need to think a little bit about the way in which we're training the next generation of applied sports psychologists. Instead of having one supervisor that operates in one sort of theoretical approach and therefore invariably transfers that onto the people they're supervising, maybe it's better to have 6 months with one supervisor and another 6 months with a different supervisor that's operating in a different theoretical approach. So people are genuinely trained, in these different kind of schools of thought, and are therefore able to competently work quite flexibly in youth sport environments. So, Yeah, that was a really interesting one from my perspective, and I think it has some strong implications for kind of where we take the field moving forward.
Sam, these environments when you're at the coalface are so dynamic, so changeable, and context is king.
Yeah.
So to speak to your main point there, I completely agree. I think that probably as a practitioner, or definitely as a practitioner at least, I can only speak for myself. You perhaps have one overarching approach, but over time, experience, education, supervision, you learn that having multiple modalities on hand, available in your mind, in your long-term memory that you can draw upon at any given moment is absolutely crucial if you're going to be a dynamic, robust practitioner, if you really are going to be able to help people in the moment, depending on the situation. And I love what you've said there in terms of training for sports psychologists in the future. And this philosophy can transfer towards coaching, I would imagine, that it's for coaches to be the very best that they can be. Experiencing multiple educational pathways, having multiple experiences from different coaches who take different approaches is only going to serve you well in terms of your capacity to deliver to different populations. And I think, to speak to your point, that's absolutely crucial for sports psychologists.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's something that's often frowned upon a little bit as well, that you pick your theoretical approach and you operate within that. So I hope, kind of shining a light on the way in which experienced practitioners are doing this provides people on the training pathways with a bit more reassurance that, it's okay to have one sort of theoretical approach, but to draw upon, those kind of different techniques from different schools of thought in order to really be effective in these youth sports environments.
On to the next theme, seeking and securing connections. Can you speak a little bit to this, please?
Yeah, so this is another one that has been sort of mentioned and talked about a little bit in the literature, but I often think people talk about its importance without talking about how you can seek and secure those connections. So I think it's another thing that just adds a little bit more kind of insight for trainee sports psychologists or anyone working with young athletes, because I guess for those that have the opportunity to work in youth sports environments on a daily basis, they've got that real unique opportunity to spend time with people before actually perhaps they even start working with them per se. So they're going to spend time in these environments. They might be kind of around, training sessions and sitting down, having meals with young athletes, whatever it may be. And therefore, a lot of them spoke about, well, we really start to build up relationships from day one. There'll be these informal chats. There'll be, asking young athletes, well, who's your favorite footballer or who's your favorite golfer, and just having a conversation to build up, some rapport and a relationship, and being, I guess, inquisitive about, their world and their experiences and what they do outside of the academy. And that's, that's a fantastic way of starting to cultivate a relationship before perhaps you even start working with an athlete. And even when practitioners spoke about, not necessarily working in youth sports environments, they try to do something similar in the sort of perhaps the initial consultancy sessions. They wouldn't start off with saying, well, why does your mum want to see me? Or sorry, why does your mum want you to see me? Or what are the issues? What are the challenges here? They say, what do you love about your sport? And why do you play this sport? What did you get out of it? Those questions, and really trying to kind of build up that initial kind of relationship with the young athletes is really important. Of course, that's easier to do perhaps in sports where you feel a little bit more comfortable, where you've got a background having played that sport, because you're perhaps slightly more on a similar sort of level. But even when that wasn't the case, they said, well, you've also got that unique opportunity to learn about the sport through the lens of the athlete, and you're not bringing in any kind of ideas about what perhaps the right answers are here. You're just genuinely interested in knowing a little bit more about it from the lens of that child, and that can be really beneficial as well. But beyond those things, just providing a great opportunity to kind of start to phase up a relationship. They also spoke about these kind of the importance of things like being genuine and being authentic and being trustworthy and being honest, because a lot of these young athletes are embedded in environments where, they're constantly being evaluated, they're constantly under the spotlight, and they're worried about potentially being released from the academies. And therefore their concern, if they open up or they show some vulnerability, is that perhaps, that's going to find its way back to the coach or back to the parents or back to the people that make the decisions. So really it's about convincing that young person that, you're all of those things, you're genuine, you're authentic, you're trustworthy, and you're going to be honest. And I think when perhaps you've done that with young athletes, then that opens the door a little bit more to really starting to assess their needs and their wants and starting to work with them as well.
So being a part of let's say a talent development pathway enables a practitioner, gives a practitioner opportunities to establish relationships. And if one isn't, and perhaps one is just, let's say, employed by mum and dad to do some Zoom sessions with a young athlete, taking small pockets of opportunities to establish that relationship. Who do you support? Why do you support them? Hey, they're doing great at the moment. They're doing rubbish at the moment. Those type of mini conversations to establish some rapport goes a long way to the potential efficacy and effectiveness of what you're trying to deliver from a psychological perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. The quality of the relationship plays such an important role, doesn't it? And with young people, you might be starting in a bit more of a kind of relaxed way in terms of those interactions by just kind of getting a sense of who they are and what they really enjoy about their sport, before perhaps you then progress on to talk about what they might be struggling with or what might be the reason why perhaps you're sitting down with them. So yeah, just some basic strategies really around things that can guide a conversation, things that young athletes like talking about, and invariably their favorite athletes are really nice starting points for those interactions.
In your conversations with sports psychologists, a theme that came out of those conversations, the next theme, multiple perspectives matter. Can you talk to us a little bit about multiple perspectives?
Yeah, so this was really sort of located in the context of needs analyses, and they spoke about this being a really kind of continuous, ongoing and dynamic process. And I think perhaps the most important element of this that came out was that it invariably starts with the person that contacts the practitioner. And that's, of course, normally, someone that works in the environments of a coach, or it might be the parent. And therefore, instead of just saying, okay, well, you've suggested that I work with this young athlete, I'm going to go and work with them. It's a case of saying, no, I want to really unpack this with you first and foremost. I want to know what you think is going on for this young athlete. And then trying to broaden that out as well. If it's a case of saying, well, the parents come to me and asked, if I can work with their child. I've spoken to the parent a lot about their view of this, but I'd also like to know a little bit more about the coach's view of this, or, it might even be a host family, or, the people within that kind of athlete's environment. And essentially, we're talking about team formulation here. But I think it's so much perhaps more important in the context of youth sport, because you've got so many people around a young athlete that are influencing their development and perhaps their performances and their well-being as well. So by speaking to all of those people, you can get a much better understanding of what's going on for that young person. And of course, young people might lack that kind of self-awareness or that ability to reflect and really articulate themselves. So being able to kind of speak to lots of different people and triangulate that is a really valuable starting point for practitioners working in youth sport. And for some, that was enough. That was enough then to actually inform the intervention itself. And sometimes, it never was directly with the young athlete. It was a case of working with the people around them to try and alter or recreate the environment. If it was a case of saying, well, I'm actually going to go on to then, chat with the young athlete here, then of course the conversations that would initiate that, and it often, started with fairly informal interactions and conversations. It wasn't kind of an interview-based setting. It was a chat, and it was often a chat about, the demands of the sport and what they think makes their sport really difficult and challenging. You might then talk about, kind of best and worst performances, and then sort of progress on to talk about some of the issues and challenges that they may be facing. So it's just a little bit of a structure there, in terms of how people can navigate what essentially is a needs analysis process. But of course, you've also got, great opportunities in youth sport contexts around being able to observe what's going on. And I always think an occupational psychologist can't walk into the workplace and see what's going on for that person, or a clinical psychologist can't come into your house and see how you interact with your partner and how that might be the crux of the issue. But you can do that in youth sport. You can speak to people, you can speak to the athlete, you can go and observe what's going on for them. And therefore you get this really kind of clear picture around what might be going on and how that might then be able to inform some of the interventions that you go on to deliver.
Sam, we live in a data-driven world in sport these days, and I know from my own experience in the past when I've been involved in talent development pathways, when as I walk through the door, I'm asked, how can we measure this? And, what you're saying there makes me think, reminds me of times where virtually the first thing being said to me is that measurement and questions around measurement, and then the suggestion of, well, can we use questionnaires? Can we use some kind of profiling or rating system? The psychologists you spoke to talked about the importance of essentially 360-degree feedback, but does that 360-degree feedback include, did they speak to questionnaires and some form of profiling as a part of this theme?
Yeah, they often didn't, and I would ask
Okay.
exactly that question around. Okay, are you kind of tracking progress over time here as well? And a lot of them said, well, we do, because it's a requirement of the people that we're working for. But I think they're using it in different ways. They're interested, of course, in what young athletes are saying through the questionnaires that they're completing, but they're often perhaps looking for like discrepancies as well, in terms of what I'm seeing with this young athlete versus what they're reporting in some of the kind of objective data is very different. And that's interesting in and of itself. Are they concerned about their future in the academy, and therefore they're trying to inflate their scores and show, really high levels because they think it might be influencing, some of the decisions about their future. So it was more a case of actually being used to please the people that you're working for, but also potentially as a stimulus for a conversation, to say, I noticed that you scored really highly on this, should we chat a little bit about that? What does this mean to you? And unpacking it from there. So yeah, kind of often using that as a way of assessing needs, but I don't think they pin too much on it.
Yeah, the amount of social desirability you experience when it comes to answers. Mark had a 10 for this. 10, 10, 10. I'm super confident. I focus all the time. It's something that, as you say, given the right reporting system in the right context at the right time, can potentially spark really good conversation and can be used to compare and contrast to the real world experiences, the real world behaviours that you're seeing from youth players.
Yeah, absolutely.
The next theme is indirect interventions maximise the impact. Can you unpack this for us, please?
Yeah, so this was really clear in the data around the most effective interventions are typically the ones that are delivered indirectly through the coaches and through the parents. And of course, we're not the first people to speak about this in the literature. And I always think back to Dan Brown's meta-analysis that he published in 2017 around kind of psychological interventions and effectiveness from a performance perspective. And the most effective interventions in that study were the ones that were delivered by the coaches, which causes uproar from a sports psychology perspective. But the point there is important. It's around, they're the people that have the existing connection and relationship with the athletes. And therefore, the athletes are probably more likely to listen to what the coaches are saying than perhaps what the sports psychologist is saying. And there's also the element around consistency of message and reinforcement that I think plays a role there as well. And the practitioners in the study spoke about almost thinking who is best positioned to deliver this intervention. And it's similar to what we were talking about in terms of kind of the needs assessments and the multiple perspectives. And sometimes it might be a case of saying, well, if this is the issue and challenge that the young person is experiencing, who's best positioned perhaps to support them through that process? And a lot of the time it might not be the sports psychologist. It might be actually a case of saying, well, what can we do with the parents here to change the environment or change kind of what's happening for that young person, or the coach, or whoever it may be. And I think that's really important because, it might be a case of saying, well, we've got a young athlete here that's really anxious before tournaments. And then when they go on and perform, actually, if things don't go well, we see a lot of anger and frustration. And therefore, they're kind of showing all these signs of being very ego orientated. And actually, they might be in that transition between childhood and adolescence, and they're starting to realize that actually, irrespective of how hard I try, some people might just be better than me at this, and they're becoming more ego orientated because of the cognitive changes that are happening for them. And that's a very normative transition. But perhaps the parents and coaches are not aware of that. So it's a case of normalizing things and transitions which are happening for that young person, and perhaps educating and supporting them through that process. But then also saying, well, how do we create an environment that's perhaps a bit more mastery or task orientated, so that it acts as a bit of a safety net for that young person, because we've put them into a very adult structured environment as well, that's focused on ratings and rankings. And there's a lot of pressure now to progress and develop and win some tournaments. It's all starting to get a bit more serious. So then it's a case of saying, well, what can we do to solidify that environment a little bit more for that young person, and say, well, let's, really start to focus on some process goals that are within their control a little bit more. So even if they don't get the results, we can link it back to some progress that's being made in relation to something they've been working on in training, and protect that sense of competence. So a lot of what they were talking about was this type of intervention where, they're pulling the strings behind the scene. They're working really closely with the key people in that young person's environment. But actually, the people that are interacting with the child, that are changing the context for that child, are actually, the coach or parent or the support staff. So I think that was really important around kind of these indirect interventions. And then similarly, within the context of more sort of psychological skills training, the ones that were then working kind of in the environments were looking for opportunities to embed interventions in what was happening in that environment, and essentially trying to move towards a really psychologically informed environment where, there might be really clear routines that they go through, that there's, clearly a process of reflecting on performance, after a tournament or a match, and a real sort of unpacking of the experience and a learning of that experience. And even, in training context, it might be, are we actually replicating the demands that this young athlete's facing in competition in the training setting? So really just trying to make sure that environment is really conducive to developing this young person, and not just solely focused on outcomes and progress.
Sam, when I first started out my journey as a sports psychologist just under 2 decades ago, some of the messages that you might hear from coaches at that time tended to orient around, well, I'm the sports psychologist. And over time, I think with the proliferation of great information over the internet, much more holistic coaching courses, opportunities for coaches to experienced sports psychologists speak and work with them. I think the narrative now is very much more an understanding of, I'm not, and I'm speaking as a coach here, I'm not a sports psychologist per se, but I do psychology every single second of every single day within my role. So it's in my best interest to deliver on this to the best of my ability. And that's what I find now in my work at the Coalface, is working with and through coaches. It's about having more sophisticated conversations with them about the psychology of their players, their team, developing psychologically informed environments to speak to what you said there, laying down simple mental frameworks that help them to make better decisions related to the people in their environment. That's been my sort of experience of how things have evolved in the field the last couple of decades that I've been involved.
Yeah, so I guess it comes back to this notion of kind of who's spending most time with the young athletes.
Yeah.
And therefore there's so much consistency in their lives that are provided by parents, and you hope with coaches as well that actually, the best way is to try and work with coaches, work with parents, because they're going to be able to really, consistently reinforce those messages. And sometimes you might have to convince, the parents or the coaches around the importance of what you're saying, or why perhaps, it's better to be more process orientated than kind of ego outcome orientated. And therefore that's kind of the educational piece, I think, sometimes. But once you convince someone around its importance, I guess you then progress onto the phase of okay, well, how do we do this in practice? And that's where I think the role of the sports psychologist is most important, because there's a lot of nuance and complexity there around, well, let's look at kind of the way in which you interact with this young person and the messages that are being communicated. And sometimes there's a discrepancy between what people think they do and what they actually do. And therefore, with technology these days and video recordings, you can really kind of use that and as a stimulus for an interaction and conversation, and say, well, what I'm seeing here is this, and perhaps what you're intending to do is this. So let's look at the type of behaviors, that someone might display, perhaps if they're developing a more master-orientated climate, and then track that and give feedback. And then you're essentially working with a coach there. But what I really like about that is it can withstand the test of time. So, then there's going to be a real reinforcement, consistency around that message, that's really going to help that young person, whether you're there or not, as a sports psychologist. And that's really important to me.
A final theme, Sam, adaptation and integration determines PST, psychological skills training, effectiveness. Can you speak to adaptation and integration to finish off here?
Yeah, sure. And I guess this takes it full circle, doesn't it? Where we began talking a little bit about what typical kind of psychological skills training, or more formalized psychological skills training, used to look like. And actually kind of the way in which practitioners are delivering it these days is much more interesting. And just before I get onto that, I think one of the fascinating things at the start of the study was we gave out a kind of pre-interview booklet, or a pre-focus group booklet, and we asked them to list down what the most effective strategies were across different age groups. And with all the core strategies like imagery, self-talk, relaxation, goal setting, routines, modeling, all of them featured in each of the different developmental stages by at least one of the practitioners. So essentially what practitioners are saying here is that everything can be effective, but ultimately it depends on the extent to which it's adapted and integrated effectively into that young person's environment. And that's very different to the traditional way in which, it'd be a case of saying, well, I'm going to deliver all these sessions, and then you're somehow going to magically be able to transfer that into the real world context and benefit from it subsequently as well. And really what it was about was, as I alluded to previously, was about finding a really interesting topic when you're working with young athletes and saying, well, what are these young athletes interested in? And a lot of time it might be, being as resilient as Djokovic, or performing under pressure, whatever, you can kind of use as a title to capture a young person's interest. And then starting with those, YouTube videos, talking about different scenarios, something that's really tangible, something that's visible for that young person that they can see and buy into. And even things like biofeedback, seeing how the body responds under stress, and using something that really connects with that young athlete to sell them on something before you then take those examples and attach them to relevant skills that might be useful. So it's really the process of delivery that I think is integral here. But essentially, it's a way of working with young athletes that helps them buy into the process, and ultimately they see the value of why they're doing this, and they see what the strategies or techniques can offer them. And it might be that, some people don't respond particularly well to a certain strategy, but they're able to build a routine that works for them in their context, in their particular sport. And that's not going to be the same for everybody. But they've all bought into the process because you've delivered it in a really exciting, captivating, tangible, connectable way to this young person. And I think that made a lot of sense to me around, how you can really kind of deliver this in a way in which young people are not only going to listen, but it's perhaps going to have a knock-on effect on them consistently doing this across their career.
YouTube is a sports psychologist's dream companion.
Yeah.
It really is. It's just, if you can find a clip of an athlete who competes in your, let's call them your client's sport, then that clip can do a lot of the convincing for you.
Yeah, exactly, isn't it? You could say exactly the same thing, but it's not going to connect with that young person in the same way that perhaps Ronaldo talking about it would, and we've done things in the past where we've, shown videos of Djokovic, in a really important match, and we'll say, what's he doing differently depending on whether he's won or lost that point? And young athletes are watching it really carefully and they're going, he's doing nothing differently, absolutely nothing differently. And then you might be able to say, well, let's look at what you do when you win or lose a point, and perhaps their routine changes dramatically. They go from perhaps taking 10 or 15 seconds between a point to 5 seconds, and they're no longer conforming to their routine. And then if you can show them a sort of follow-up video of Djokovic explaining what he's doing, prior to serving, and all the sort of thought processes and the sort of recognizing that time traveling doesn't necessarily work particularly effectively, and trying to bring himself back into that present moment and taking a couple of deep breaths, and then choosing where to serve, they really buy into that. Then they realize that actually they haven't been doing that all the time, and that's a really good thing to do. So yeah, it certainly helps sell the product, even though perhaps, it's not any different to you trying to convince them it's really important to do.
Sam, what does all this mean? I mean, within your discussion for this piece of research, what did you highlight for those who read through the piece, speaking to sports psychologists out there, coaches out there, parents out there? Just to close things out here, what were the main considerations in your discussion?
Yeah, I think what I really wanted to try and communicate throughout this whole study was what sports psychologists actually do. And I used that as the kind of tweet that I put out. And I think that was probably why it was so popular, because it was always something I'd been really interested in terms of, I've read so much and I've been trained, I've gone through all the right steps on the training pathway, but I never felt like I truly understood, what actually happens in applied practice. And maybe that's partly because of the training pathway, and there's not, many opportunities to observe what's happening or even watch videos around people, working within different theoretical approaches. So I think it was about trying to shine a light on what goes on in the real world. And therefore, I think the intended audience was typically kind of young practitioners who are kind of embarking on the training pathway and are trying to figure this out for themselves. But even those that are practicing, maybe some reassurance around what they're doing is similar to what other people are doing. And therefore, in the discussion section, we really just try to kind of unpack the points that we've made in the results and link them back to other relevant bodies of work. A lot of the time it wasn't, studies that had focused on youth sport. It was a case of saying, well, a lot of these, examples we've offered have been about what people are doing in with young athletes, but a lot of it's transferable as well. When we're talking about, fairly flexible consultancy approaches, or how to build relationships, or how to deliver things in effective ways, I don't think they're disconnected from what practitioners would be doing with slightly older athletes or elite athletes. So the principles are fairly broad and hopefully are relevant, to lots of practitioners, not just those that are working in youth sport context. So that was really what we were trying to do in the discussion.
And I would say it's an important read for coaches and parents as well, because, we still live in a world where we have to help coaches and parents understand what we do and how we go about it, to speak to the point you've just made, not just to educate young practitioners, but also to help those who are at the coalface coaching, or those parents who are invested in their child's sport, where we can help, where we can work with them to have fantastic experiences from aid well-being, development and performance, learning, development and performance. So I think it's a paper that is useful there. And finally, what next? Where's this leading to?
Yeah, good question.
Best question of the hours podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. We've actually the second project of the research working group has been a position statement. And that, as I sort of mentioned before, is really trying to bring the academic experimental research and the study like this one that's looked at kind of what practitioners are doing, and generate some real clear kind of recommendations for youth sports organizations, from training and accrediting bodies, from researchers, and also for practitioners themselves. And really it is what it says on the tin. It's a reflection of the the state of the literature at this point in time and the things that ultimately we need to do in order to progress and advance knowledge and understanding within this field.
Fantastic. Sam, absolutely brilliant conversation. I can't thank you enough for your time. How can people find you, follow you, and get in contact with you?
Yeah, so I'm on X, so people can follow me. It's at Dr. Sam Thrower, and I don't tweet loads, but I normally tweet about good papers and retweet other cool stuff that's happening in the field. Or they can of course email me. It's sthrower@brookes.ac.uk.
You are the first person to say X without saying Twitter, so that suggests an evolution there, doesn't it?
Thanks. I'm glad I'm up to date on something.
Well, there you go. Hey, Sam, thank you so much for your time today. That was absolutely brilliant.
Thanks, Dan. Really enjoyed it.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.